I'm Brian with the Tube Clock Database. Today we're going to be talking about the IV12 clock from NixieKits.eu. It was designed and built by Jordan Grau. It's a 6-digit VFD clock with LED-based lighting. And with that, let's take a closer look. Okay, so let's start with a 360-degree view of the clock. Let me just rotate it for the camera here. See the back side. Now let's just flip it this way. Underneath it's just a black piece of plexiglass. We've got 4 little rubber stoppers here that keeps it mounted firmly on your desk. Let's rotate the clock like this for a second here and see if we can show these. There's 3 little buttons across the front which you use for setting the time, user settings, display effects, and things like that. There's a button we use on top here to control the backlight for the LEDs. There are 2 colon indicators right here. They're RGB LEDs and they're displaying a nice cyan color which matches the tubes perfectly. And then just for relative size comparison, here's a can of Coke. So this is a top-down view of the clock. The clock itself ships with a clear plexiglass case, which allows you to see the inner workings without having to disassemble it. So what we have up front here is this is the power supply. We've got a couple inductors here, capacitors. We've got 3 little buttons here for setting the time, the date, things like that. Microprocessor. We've got the button for changing the LED lighting. Again, DC input. Back here, this is a 1 farad supercapacitor for storing the date and time in case of a power outage. And here we have a little piezoelectric speaker for the alarm. Okay, so I've turned off the LED underlighting here, and I just want to focus on the actual tubes themselves. First thing I want to point out is that all the tubes fade nicely between the different digits here, which is a bit of an engineering feat and adds a level of polish to this clock, which I really like. The second is that once a minute, I have it set to display a transition effect between the time. And so when it hits 60 here, we can see it does what's called the slot machine effect, where it randomly displays digits on the screen, and it picks the correct time for the hours, the minutes, and the seconds. So while we're still talking about the physical construction of the clock, let's talk about the actual enclosure a little bit. We've got the very bottom component here, and sitting on that is this, essentially it's a spacer which allows room for the soldering on the underside of the PCB which sits on top of it. Next up, we've got essentially it's a piece of plexiglass here which will act as the socket. You'll put the pins in these little holes here and solder up to the board below. Place this layer on top of it next, and this provides some stability for the tube so they can't slide around. And then lastly, we're going to seal it off with this very top piece here, and the tubes just simply sit in the nice little hole that is formed by all of the layers. So let's take a second here and talk about the lighting underneath the tubes. Under each tube is an RGB LED, and it's all controlled via this little button here. Now, this button serves a couple of purposes. If you press it and hold it down, the display goes off. If you press it and hold it down, it turns it back on. But you can do other things too. So let's say, for example, there's a color we really like, this magenta color here. I can press the button once and just freeze it at that color. I can press it again and the display resumes, cycling through different colors. And there are about there's about a dozen or so different programmed color effects, and I'll show them in a second. And you can cycle through them by pressing this button here. And so it's choosing a different program now. And then we have these little markers in here, like we've got this flashing cyan color. And that lets me know where I am in the program cycle. So there's flashing cyan, flashing red, flashing green, and things like that. So we know where we are. So with that, let's take a look at the manual and I'll show you what I'm talking about. Okay, so on the back of the manual is this diagram here. And what happens is every time we double press that little button I was just showing you, it switches to the next color program. And each one of these is a different, essentially, display effect. Now we've got things in here where it says marker 2x yellow flashing. What happens is when the display was pulsing yellow or cyan or something like that, it was letting us know here is where we are in the diagram. And so by looking at what colors are flashing, we can tell what will come next. To cycle through all these, again, just double press the button. If you want to turn it off, press the button and hold it down. And if you really just like a color, press the button once to pause the effect. This is the manual for the clock. Let's just flip through it real quick. We have all of the technical data for the clock, some pretty common sense safety precautions. And then it jumps into, here's the display mode, here's the setup mode, here's what they do, here's how you use them, and then into the options, things like displaying the date format, the transition effects, how to fine-tune the clock accuracy. And I like that he provides, pretty much 4 common use case scenarios. How do you set the time? How do you set the alarm? How do you turn the alarm on and off? And how do you set the date? Essentially the 4 most common things you'd want to use a clock for. And it ends with all of the LED sequences that we were just showing you. The clock is sold as a kit, and these are all of the major components. We have the plexiglass pieces here we talked about at the beginning. The vacuum tubes, each one's nicely boxed. The inductors, pins, capacitors, resistors, integrated circuits, the diodes. Most of the mounting hardware, though nuts and bolts, and then again a few buttons here for the user. We have the PCB, we'll take a closer look at that in a second, and finally a forming tool to help with all of the resistor leads, diode leads, and things like that. Now I wanted to just take a second here to show off the nice circuit board here. Obviously it's a blue design with white silk screening. Some of the major components here are labeled to help with assembly. This is the front, and this is the back. This is the assembly manual that comes with the clock here. I just want to call out a couple major elements. We've got some good starting advice and safety precautions. Plenty of clear photos showing what each step should look like along the way. A nice diagram of how the component should sit on the board, so as you're building it, you can use this as a nice quick reference. And lastly, it ends with a very clear wiring diagram. And this shot is pretty self-explanatory. On the left-hand side, we have the IN12 clock from NixieKits.eu. And on the right-hand side, we have the IV12 clock, also from NixieKits.eu. This is the end of the review. Up next are just some close-up shots of the clock in action. But the question I ask myself at the end of every review is, if I broke this, would I buy it again? And it's an absolute yes. It's a really good value for your money. It's got a very clean, intuitive layout. I really like the LED underlighting, even more than I thought I would. The case itself is very solid and very professional. And, if you were trying to assemble this from a kit, even if you had relatively, elementary skills, you should be able to assemble this so long as you look at the manual, you look at the diagrams, and you pay attention to what you're doing. So, at the end of the day, I've got to recommend this clock here. I think it's a really solid design.